The Coalition of Texans with Disabilities, Raise Your Voice 2022, Public Systems Failing Children, November 7th, 2022.
First of all, welcome. See a bunch of familiar faces and some new ones here. Today, as you know, we'll be talking about multiple systems and kind of, that serve children or support children and families, and kind of where the breakdown has been across multiple systems, largely impacted, as you can imagine, by COVID-19. So after numerous investigations, not just recently, but even over the years, lots of media coverage, there have been outcries from individuals, from groups, from organizations to address some critical issues impacting Texas children. It looks like about 86% of you have some kind of knowledge or have been following what's happening in special education. About 36% in childcare, about 43% in child protective services, 50% in youth justice, and 50% in school safety. We can't obviously say that one of these is more important than the other. They're all really critical systems that, that are meant to support and protect our children in Texas. And so you may be asking yourself within all of these, how does this impact kids with disabilities? And so we're going to talk about that today. That's why we're here. The first item we are going to talk about is, and I think the one that most of you are familiar with, and this is an ongoing issue that has a whole bunch of other buckets of issues under the larger umbrella of special education. We know Texas has a long history, obviously, of this is an issue that CTD has been covering for a very long time, but Texas has a long history of not quite getting it right when it comes to special education, identifying students who are eligible, providing timely evaluations, providing services, or even just transitioning. So from early childhood intervention to early childhood special education to K through 12, and then, whatever post-secondary opportunities there are after. We know that there are a lot of spots in there where kids can fall through the cracks. And that's certainly true here in Texas. One of the greatest things that we've discussed on here as well, and it can't be ignored, but the impact that COVID and other events have had on the workforce in Texas. And we do know several reports have highlighted that that special education teachers, bilingual teachers, the shortages have really hit those two specific professions disproportionately. And so we know that we have a shortage of special education teachers or paraprofessionals, and that's certainly, we see that impacting students with disabilities. There are still delays in identification of students. This is continuing now almost 3 years since COVID knocked on our door, where, we saw this huge backlog across various districts in the state of Texas in meeting those timelines for kids, identifying eligible kids or potentially eligible kids, completing evaluations on time, implementing those plans, those individualized education plans for students with disabilities, having those implemented on time, and even the service array being limited due to shortages, like speech therapists and counselors, occupational therapists, aides. So, how do we move forward from here? There have been a number of proposed solutions, many that are just not new. One of them being looking at how we fund special education in Texas. We know that currently there's kind of this perverse incentive to have more restrictive placements for students who might otherwise be able to access the general education classes, learn alongside their non-disabled peers with additional support. However, the funding weights are very different. What we know is that on one end of the spectrum, we're looking at complete general education with no supports, which is not a reality. And then on the other end, complete self-contained. But we know that kids are the majority of kids, if not all, are falling somewhere along the middle. And so recommendations from us and from other partner organizations and legislators have been to fund the service array and not the physical placement, because we know special education is not a place. There's some other issues that have really, that we've been keeping a close eye on, sadly, are instances of restraint and use of force. How is this related to teacher shortages? Well, if we have schools that are understaffed, we have a lot of subs, we have a lot of paraprofessionals who are not certified teachers who are stepping in and leading classes. They're exhausted. They are feeling underappreciated in our current climate in Texas. And so we've seen an uptick of improper restraints, of use of force. Some of you may remember we issued a joint statement with Disability Rights Texas and some other core advocacy organizations almost a year ago, calling on lawmakers to really look at this, to step up and to take action. And we are going to continue to push that as we move into this next legislative session. Excuse me. The second area we're going to talk about is childcare. And if you guys have questions as we're talking, you feel free to put them in the chat and we'll definitely be checking those, or and you'll have plenty of opportunity to ask questions when we're finished as well. Childcare, we know, is critical for our workforce. We know that working parents rely on high quality, safe childcare so that they can work, they can go to school. It's also a really important developmental stage where kids are learning problem solving, they're learning social skills, you know, they're learning how to communicate. And not all have equal access to high quality childcare. This is true certainly before the pandemic, but the pandemic has certainly exacerbated that. Childcare providers are still suffering, even compared to pre-pandemic. A lot of reasons for this. They're very low pay, very, very low pay. We talk about this a lot at CTD. Some of the most valued, most important folks, like those attendants that we rely on, are really underpaid and haven't seen a bump in kind of base salary in a very long time. They also don't typically have any benefits. So when you're thinking about really being taxed because you don't have any time off, you don't get holidays, you don't get sick pay, it's another contributing factor. Rising costs. We all see it when we go to the grocery store. We've all seen rising costs in housing. We've seen just day-to-day materials that, you know, that we may need to access. That's certainly true within childcare centers as well. Some providers have just closed permanently. You know, it was really hard to try and hang on, even with some small boosts to childcare. Financially, it was just too much. So we have seen just a decrease in the availability of providers across the state of Texas, which obviously impacts all of us, even more so, say, in rural areas where there are already very few options. Affordability, you know, again, rising costs. Some folks saw, you know, employment decreased or lost their employment, and we're trying to get back into the workforce. How do we do that? We have to be able to afford childcare, and that's becoming increasingly unaffordable. It already was bad prior to COVID. We do need more opportunities for, say, for subsidized childcare for those very low income families. We you know, we need more options. We need to support not just the workforce, excuse me, for childcare providers, but also for the families so that they can get access to childcare. And one thing that, you know, you probably hear me talk about a lot is opportunities for inclusive childcare for our young children with disabilities. Having a provider who is well-trained, having a provider who can collaborate well with the family, or even an early childhood intervention specialist that's working with a young child. Knowing the requirements to provide care, unless it's, you know, an assessment of the child's needs and reasonable accommodations exceed what the child care provider can do. But, you know, what we've found is providers are often unaware that the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to them. And so there can't be a blanket policy of we just don't take kids with disabilities. This is an issue we've been working on for several years. We're really happy to report, at least in this area impacting children, that we have seen the Health and Human Services Commission take a step in the right direction and really meaningfully consider some of the recommendations that CTD has previously provided. Some items that were included in our inclusive childcare bill we worked on with Representative Gonzalez's office last session. So we have seen some changes there. We're hoping that we're turning a quarter, but until it's official, it's not official, right? And this is something that we will continue to monitor as well. Finally, this is a final item before I kick it over to Jennifer Toon, but and perhaps one of the hardest for us to talk about is Child Protective Services. The Department of Family and Protective Services has long been riddled with scandal violations. Our foster care system has been deemed unconstitutional and placing children at severe risk. So what does that look like today? I'm going to share some alarming stats, and these are things that maybe you guys have heard in the media. Some of you who work directly with children may have already been concerned with, but are really important statistics for us to know. This is the data that's out there. We know, unfortunately, about 1 in 10 children without disabilities are victims of some kind of abuse or neglect. That number for kids with disabilities is 1 in 3. That's unacceptable. Excuse me. Another statistic, while 5.2% of school-age children have a disability, in Texas, children with disabilities are overrepresented in the DFPS system, making up 53% of the current caseload. So as you can see, that's pretty shocking. 5.2% of kids, school-age kids, have a disability, but we see this drastic overrepresentation when we're looking at those kids within the DFPS system. We know that Texas is currently not compliant with the federal Family First program. This supports keeping families together, right? We're always trying to ensure that to the greatest extent possible, we keep families together. But Texas is failing in that respect. And that can be particularly dangerous for, say, a family who has a child with a disability, and maybe that parent knows the medical history, that parent knows all the medications and the therapies. They know, you know, the how to work with their child. They know that, excuse me, what's effective. Really are in any respect that they're, you know, the expert on their child. And so if you remove that, which we are often too quick to do, that kid goes into a system that is not prepared and is not set up for them. We also know that the outcomes are not good. They're 50%, kids with disabilities are 50% less likely to be adopted. They're less likely to finish high school. They're less likely to go on to some post-secondary opportunities. They often, about 20% of them, are just instantly homeless when they age out. Excuse me. And then they're also subjected to financial abuse in some instances. So for instance, if there is a child with a disability in foster care and they're eligible for Social Security, and that foster care parent, adult, caregiver applies for Social Security, well, we're talking about a minor with a disability. And so they become the designated payee, which essentially means they're controlling that money. So that's also really concerning for kids who find themselves in the foster care system. So I know this has been a lot of really heavy stuff, but we are gonna talk about, what can we do and what is on the horizon. Before we do that, I'm gonna kick it over to Jennifer Toon, who is going to share the latest in TJJD and youth justice.
Yeah, thanks, Jolene. My name is Jennifer Toon. I am the policy fellow here at CTD. As Jolene's talking about all these systems that continue to fail our children, for most of these kids, it leads inevitably to one outcome, which is the youth justice system, the juvenile justice system. But before we get all the way down to TJJD, I want to go back a little bit and talk about, Jolene mentioned restraints. And so when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, and we call it that because that is exactly what it is, it sets up kids at school to be funneled right into the criminal justice system. And how does that happen? Well, first, let's talk about restraints. In 2017 to 2018 school year, there was 70,000 students who were restrained. 80% of those restraints were kids with disabilities. They represent 13% of the school student population, but they have 80% restraints. As Jolene said, these numbers are completely unacceptable. We worked on a bill that we are going to have refiled. It was called No Kids in Cuffs. Maybe some of our regulars on the call remember us talking about that bill last session, and that would prohibit law enforcement and school resource officers from handcuffing and pepper spraying children under 10 years old, because shockingly, they do that. And so when a child is restrained, often what happens in a school setting, often to cover themselves, they file charges against the child they restrained for assault. And so since we know that the kids that are suffering from these restraints the most are kids with disabilities, they, of course, are the ones that have the juvenile justice involvement, because the school will file charges on them. And this is manifestations of disability, right? And they're criminalizing that, essentially. So from the school to prison pipeline, the kids end up in the Texas Juvenile Justice Department, formerly known as the Texas Youth Commission. And I see familiar faces from last week's discussion on TJJD. And why is this issue, why is this state agency, state system so important to us as we talk about our kids? Well, this is where the majority end up, and it is the worst possible outcome for all of our children. So in TJJD, 60 to 80% of that population are children with mental health and or intellectual or developmental disabilities. As I was researching this, I always promote this book. It's called Who Gets a Childhood? It's by William Bush. He was a professor at the time at the Texas A&M University in San Antonio. And myself and a couple other members of our advocacy group around the campaign to close TJJD facilities will be meeting with him soon so that he can help us with our campaign to finish the 5, which refers to shutting down the 5 state facilities that you may have seen in the news recently about just how horrible those conditions are. Kids are kept in isolation. They don't have enough staff to let them out to use the restroom. They're not getting their programs in. It was a huge jump in suicide and self-harm. And what was interesting as I'm digging into the research behind the long history of terrible, terrible abuse and neglect in our juvenile justice system is that I came across a number, and it said that a research study done in the 30s and 40s showed that 90% of the kids in the system at the time had what we now call IDD. And it shows you that this population has remained the focal point of the juvenile justice system. And I've always believed it's, an underlying belief about our kids. I can't understand why else this continues in cycle after cycle of abuse to reform to abuse to reform, that this continues to happen. And again, to go back to Jolene's point, this is unacceptable for our kids. So we will be working on the campaign to close those facilities, many of them that are 100 years old, that this abuse and neglect is happening, and get our kids into real care, trauma-informed care, and get them back into the community and start treating this like the public health crisis that it is. So I want to turn this over to Josette, if there she is. And please, Josette, introduce yourself, and we're going to talk about mental health, because as we've talked about all of these systems with our kids, I think the overall overreaching theme here is what's happening to our kids' mental health in every single one of these systems.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, everybody, for inviting me here to talk today a little bit about some of the gaps and the opportunities related to children's mental health. I am Josette Saxton, and I'm the Director of Mental Health Policy at Texans Care for Children. And I just to give a description of myself, I have, I think, sort of longish brown hair. I wear glasses, and I think behind me is probably a messy bookcase and desk. So don't judge me too harshly on that. So to start off, just to sort of even, echo back to, I think, what Jolene was saying earlier, that we know that a lot of kids were struggling before the pandemic with mental health concerns, and that these concerns were actually rising in recent years. So even like in the past decade, just for an example, this is from data that was, sort of collected at the federal level, but it is for Texas kids. It was estimated that 1 in 10 youth in Texas had an ADHD diagnosis, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. About 1 in 11 kids had behavioral or conduct problems. About 1 in 12 kids has anxiety, and about 1 in 20 kids have depression. This was before going into the pandemic. I don't think it's any surprise that we know that, the pandemic was hard, especially hard on kids who were already struggling. So it was hard on kids, who had a disability, a developmental disorder, or mental health concerns. And so it's really important that we not only are addressing the needs of kids who have a mental health diagnosis, who need access to services and supports, but then also to really look at how are we supporting the mental health and wellness of all of our kids, because so many kids have been impacted through the challenges in recent years. One of the things I just, wanted to highlight too is that when we're looking at the services and supports that schools are supposed to provide students with disabilities, that for many kids with mental health concerns, even those with a diagnosed mental health disorder, and even many of those kids who have what the public mental health system considers or identifies as a serious or severe emotional disturbance, that does not automatically mean that a student will be eligible for special education services. So when we're thinking about kids that are struggling with mental health concerns, we know that, I think all kids, they're spending so much time in school that it's really a place where we should not only be providing targeted interventions and supports to help those kids who maybe need a little bit more help to be able to, again, I want to, stress that it's not that we're looking for schools to treat mental health concerns among kids, but just like within special education services, if there are things that schools can do to help that child child learn that fall within the areas of social emotional development or, behavior, the mental health sort of domain, that it behooves schools to do it to help, students learn. Thankfully, in 2019, the legislature did pass some laws that put an expectation on schools, requirements on schools, that they have some level of practices and procedures in place to address student mental health, to provide trauma-informed classroom, hallways, buses, lunchrooms, to also look at, how can we help address students, the important sort of life skills, their social emotional skills, such as how to sort of deal with the big feelings that, we all feel, how to control some of the, our impulses and behaviors. These are all things that schools have been told by the legislature that they should have something in place to address, which is a good thing. And I will tell you that, in talking with school districts, across the state, that they really have been leaning in on trying to help kids feel more connected and more supported, and to help them address with some of the traumas and stressors that they've, experienced in the past few years. However, what the legislature didn't do was provide school districts with any funding to be able to implement these practices
Do this, we're going to spend money on these.
kids. Do better in school. And I will say that these types of school-wide practices, they help. They have been shown to help all kids do better in school, academically, socially, behaviorally. But they are really important for kids, I think, with disabilities, and they're really important for kids that do have a diagnosable mental health concern. So as I mentioned, I think a big gap here, though, is while the legislature made pretty significant investments to make sure schools can have like the physical security to meet the physical security needs that they might have. So we know which are important. And they have not provided that same level of direct support to schools to be able to implement these school-wide sort of social, emotional, psychological safety practices, and being able to provide, interventions there in the school to help students who might be struggling with trauma, with mental health concerns. Or address the mental health needs of, students who, may be receiving special education services. So one of the things that I will just sort of mention, sort of jumping ahead, among the children's mental health sort of advocacy community, one of our big focus going into the upcoming session is to have the legislature provide school districts directly with funding directly for school-wide comprehensive mental health sort of approaches and practices. So some of you might have heard that the legislature has invested in a program called T-Chat. Forgive me, I always stumble on spelling out that acronym, but basically what this program is, and it's a great program, it allows families to access mental health services using telehealth technology with a mental health professional for a limited amount of sort of visits. It's sort of like a short-term mental health service that families can access within school settings. One thing to note, though, is that the majority of kids who have mental health concerns, don't need that level of services, or their services might not meet all of the things that the child may need while they're in a school setting to help them be successful. So one of the things I want to sort of just leave with you all is that, yes, the legislature has put in place some good laws and expectations and requirements on our school districts to, support students' mental health. And while they have provided funding more for the school hardening side of school safety, and they have provided funding to provide mental health services in schools, school districts are not receiving any funding to really address the mental health needs of all kids. And so going into session, we're hoping that the legislature can, now start to increase schools, the help that the schools helping schools to use these things like trauma-informed practice, positive behavioral interventions and supports, restorative justice practices, social and emotional skills building. One of the things that I want to mention too, to sort of piggyback off of what Jennifer had said about this, the youth justice, there is a big concern that when kids are responding to trauma, when they are, when their behaviors or actions that stem from an underlying mental health concern, be that, acting out with challenging behavior, or be it just disengaging from their schoolwork, that schools will go to the more of the disciplinary response in trying to address it. And as y'all, I know, are very well aware of that, the way schools are responding to our students, behaviors does really impact how well they are going to do. And unfortunately, when our schools are relying on the more traditional disciplinary, exclusionary response, one, it's not effective because the behaviors, if they're stemming from trauma or mental health concerns or a disability, we know that just disciplining it is not going to take care of it. It's not going to produce the desired outcome. And so while there has been a lot of discussion over the past few months about supporting student mental health and children's mental health in the, in the wake of Uvalde, there has also been a lot of discussions at the Capitol and comments made that, are sort of teeing up some making it more easy for schools to discipline kids and remove them from their classroom for behaviors. So while we are looking for schools to receive funding to help support student mental health, we also need to make sure that they are appropriately responding and not using discipline inappropriately. I just wanted to now switch sort of from the school piece to talk about, for those kids that have significant mental health concerns that do require mental health treatment. One of the big gaps that we're seeing, and there's gaps everywhere, also acknowledging what Jolene said about workforce shortages and sort of the capacity of the workforce to be able to provide the types of services our kids need has really been stretched across the board. We're finding that with the local mental health authorities, which are sort of the safety net providers for community-based mental health services for kids, that they're definitely feeling that stretch. They are seeing increased number of kids that are coming in with greater mental health needs, but yet they are having a hard time, keeping, their staff. And then also, or they might have staff, but it's not necessarily the staff that they need to be able to provide the specific services that kids need. So in other words, our community mental health centers are doing, I think, a really good job at, as if a child is referred to them from a school, from TCHAT, or a family just seeking services, that they can provide them with, an intake or an assessment, some level of services. But families have to often wait for a long time to be able to receive something like, let's say, cognitive behavioral therapy, which, might be what their assessment indicates that they may need. Families, could really benefit from family partner services, which is peer support for a family who is, help in their child's, treatment, and helping to the child be able to stay, at home and be helpful at school. But families don't have access to the service. Not as many families will have access to the services, just because, again, we have these workforce, sort of issues at the local mental health authority level. Jolene, yes?
No, I was just going to hop in real quick. I think we have some questions in the chat already.
Yes.
Dennis, I think you and Chase have been tracking those. Is that correct? Dennis mentioned that.
Yes, this is one that came up about and related to special education. And the question is, Is this drive for school vouchers that would allow parents to access public education dollars to pay for private school education good or bad for students with disabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question that comes up often, and students with disabilities are usually the population where the legislature is like, okay, you go first. You're gonna go through the door first, and then we're gonna try and leave it open for everybody else. The reality of it is that if a voucher system was established in the state, I think there's this misconception that I'm going to get everything that, all the money my kid's getting right now, and I can go wherever I want to go, and I can get better services at a private school. Unfortunately, private schools do not receive federal funding and do not have to comply with IDEA. So your child is not guaranteed an individualized education plan. There's no recourse if your child is not getting free, appropriate public education. They can choose whether or not to accept. They can choose when they want to dismiss and keep your tuition, as I learned actually this week. And additionally, there's already kind of this mechanism in place under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which gives us special education. There is a mechanism already in place to be able to get private placement when the school district is unable to provide FAPE or free appropriate public education. And I think the final point I'll make is that, if you look at what it would cost to, say, piece together an educational services in the private sector for your child, that means academic, all the functional supports, behavior supports, communication, related services like therapies, that's going to cost a heck of a lot more than you would get with a voucher. It's exponentially more. So it's not really an equal, I get all of this and it translates the same when I go into the private sector. CTD has long been opposed to vouchers. We don't have a guarantee that every private school would comply with IDEA. We don't have a guarantee that it would be the same amount that is needed for all of the services based on individualized need and not just availability of money. So that's kind of where we stand. Are there any other questions, Dennis, that you
Yes.
are looking
Yes.
at?
This is an interesting one. How can, and this harkens back to a recent dark time, I think, in Texas history, and still there's residuals there. How can we ensure that kids with complex needs grow up in families, not institutions?
I think that's a question for Josette, and then I have my own question for you, Josette, if I can put you on the spot after.
No, and I would just say that I think that it's really important to make sure that families are provided with services, as much as possible in the community. We cannot keep waiting for a child to go into crisis and then look to places like residential treatment or hospitals, to be sort of the go-to intervention, because it might be the only place, available where somebody might have access to. Also want to mention, when we're looking at the intersection of, kids with both a mental health, concern and a disability, that it's even harder to access services. We hear from families that if they need to find, let's say, even crisis services for their child who might have a developmental delay or a disability or a disorder, that they're turned away from mental health providers because they say that, that they're not equipped, or they don't have services for kids with a dual diagnosis. So I think in terms of what do we need broad, we need more community-based interventions and options, I think, for families. I also want to say too, though, I mentioned earlier about family partner services. Some of the biggest things that I hear from families that makes a difference in being able to, safely keep their child that might have complex mental health concerns in their home is having somebody with lived experience who has also of raising a child with complex mental health concerns, who has been trained to provide that peer support to the family members and to sort of advocate and navigate systems, has, I think, increasing access to that type of support, in addition to those more intensive community-based supports, like things that are offered, like wraparound service planning, like the Yes Waiver program, and crisis respite facilities. These are the types of things I think can help families, or keep families together and out of these more institutional settings. Even again, keeping kids out of the juvenile justice system in CPS. And so I would say that is, I think it's really important for our lawmakers when they're looking at investing in children's mental health. It cannot just be in T-Chat, which is a few telehealth services that are provided to, some kids, or looking to build state hospital beds. We need really to shore up our community-based mental health services that provide those more intensive services that can help keep families together.
Josette, you bring up a really good point. In when we were thinking about children's mental health, it's not just direct service to the child, but also it does impact the whole family. You mentioned respite and other supports within the community. And so I think that it's really important to note that and emphasize that. I do have a quick question for you, Josette. When we're thinking about school safety, which obviously is going to be a hot topic this session, we have these two pieces, right? So we have the school safety and the emergency planning, and then we have the threat assessments. We often, caution, we don't want students with disabilities or mental health needs to get scooped up disproportionately in those threat assessments. But can you talk really about, in terms of trauma and the effects of, multiple school safety drills on young children? I know that's been some concern in the media recently. I don't know if you can speak to that just a little bit.
Well, I think just even in general, I think the school safety drills, and especially those where, it might be where, I don't want to say like an active shooter drill, where kids are present, not trauma informed. I think there's research out there that's showing that, it's making kids feel, or I should say some kids feel like less safe. And again, just being traumatic. And I think there's been, even just case study examples of saying how if you hear something that you think it is a real, let's say, emergency on campus, and you don't know any better, it could, trigger other traumatic experiences that you've had. And so, yeah, in general, I don't think that they've been shown, to be, I don't think the research is great. Don't quote me on this though, because I don't have anything right in front of me, but in general, I don't know if they really help kids feel safer. But we do know that it can be traumatic for kids. So it is important that for any type of safety drill, even being it a weather drill or again, an active shooter drill, it is paramount that schools have have that trauma lens and not needlessly expose our kids to things that are just going to make it worse for them.
Thanks, Josette. I appreciate that.
There's an interesting question. There's a jolting, I'll call this a jolting question in the chat from Linda, our friend at Texas Parent to Parent. I don't think this can be passed by, so I'll toss it out there. Linda asks, we've had 2 kids charged with class 3 felonies this week for hitting their teacher. Is this allowed? And maybe Jen, can lead on this one, but all of you might have something to say about this.
Yeah. So it is. Go ahead, Jolene.
No, I was just going to say, we see it all the time, and it's not even when the student is necessarily being the aggressor. Mm-hmm. For instance, we see kids getting charged with assault for trying to break free of a restraint, and they end up hitting the teacher in the meantime. So unfortunately, it's it's more common than you would think, but I'll let Jen elaborate.
Yeah, so this is exactly the example of the school to prison pipeline. So kids are, a manifestation of a disability, or they're, being pinned down. Oftentimes the restraints are not even proper. So again, as a way for the school district to protect themselves, they charge the child with an assault. And like Jolene said, we see this all the time. And above your comment, Linda, someone asked if the juvenile justice facilities were closed, then where would youth be served? So there's a really interesting program out of Harris County called the FIRST program. And before a child can be detained in their juvenile justice center, the officers have to contact the DA's office to get permission to do that first. And the DA looks through that. Does this child have a diagnosis of mental health or intellectual developmental disabilities? Is this child in CPS or in foster care? And really takes time to look at that child's history and to say, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to charge them. We're going to put them in the FIRST program that would help them with whatever crisis they're going through. So if we had duplicates of that type of programming that even schools could do, we wouldn't have kids just automatically charged with felonies. And once they get into the system, y'all, once they get into the juvenile justice system or even get tried as adults, because children as young as 14 can be tried as adults, services become extremely limited, almost non-existent, and any type of accommodations, I've been in both systems, you can forget it. It's not going to happen. And it becomes a veil, like a dark veil just comes over transparency to be able to see what's happening to your child, what kind of services they're getting, any type of accommodations. The school system is bad, but the criminal justice system isn't even worse. So if we closed juvenile justice facilities, what would we do? How would those kids get served? They would get served in community cares or diversion programs like this one in Harris County. And the facilities that we're talking about closing are those 5 state facilities, institutions that have been used for 2 of them for almost 100 years. They're in rural counties without staff, without mental health professionals. It's just dismal. And it goes to decriminalizing childhood behaviors. We wouldn't be able to charge children with assaults if we decriminalize certain behaviors to begin with. So that's part of the process in doing that. And then Texas has done this before. We closed several facilities when the round of scandals happened in 2007. We closed several youth facilities, and we did some decriminalization, and we got that population down from 1,000 to 600. So Texas has done this before. It's just we want to get that population just as down as much as we can, because there'll always be a core group of kids that really need specialized treatment. I know I did when I was 15 in the system, and I may not have been served well in the community. It may have not been safe for me or my community. So beginning to treat these kids in institutions or facilities that are modern, near urban centers that are able to staff it properly, and hopefully be able to put it under Human and Health Services as the health crisis it is, and not in a carceral setting.
It's a great answer. So we're kind of at the end of our time. I'll just briefly, there was one unanswered question from Glenda about counselors, whether they're trained, whether they're doing less counseling and more school administrative support. And Josette answered that all the school counselors, number one, are expected to be able to provide academic and developmental counseling, including for kids with disabilities. Whether they're actually doing that statistic, I'm sure we're going to be looking at that, and we and our friends will be advocating for that. You know, folks,
Could I also, Dennis, just even add that there was good legislation that passed last session that did require school districts to establish a policy saying that, or a policy that allowed school counselors to have 80% of their time for counseling duties, because there was also a big concern they could, where they weren't even allowed to do their academic counseling, and sort of like, career path or applying for colleges or courses. So at least now there's probably more restrictions on what school count or how school districts can use their counselors, but it's recognizing that even when counselors are counseling, a lot of them are focused on academics. And so just because a school counselor may be on campus, and a lot of schools don't have them on campus, but if they do have one, that they might not really be available to address the social, emotional concerns, the mental health needs of their kids.
Thank you, Josette. That's a very good point. We may be missing the boat on what counselors should be as a priority. Folks, I've really enjoyed being kind of a support person for this Raise Your Voice session today. We're supposed to be the adults in the room. We're supposed to be watching out for the kids who really, we shouldn't expect them to advocate for themselves or know what it is to get a fair shake as a kid growing up. We shouldn't have kids under 10 years old be handcuffed in school. We shouldn't have them charged with felonies. We shouldn't be putting them in juvenile justice facilities. We shouldn't be having them grow up in nursing homes when we have proven success of supporting families to take them in as extra support for foster care of kids with disabilities. If we can't advocate for this, what can we advocate for? So I'm going to encourage everyone to really hang on to pay special attention to children's issues into the upcoming session. They claim that there's going to be some opportunity for movement. There will be opportunity for funding. And you know what? The time is long past due, and this has to be a priority. And the priority can't be doing things like, as we heard, hardening the schools, making them more unfriendly, making them an environment that's more difficult to learn, an environment that you're scared in, as a former classroom teacher myself, I'm just, that just drives me crazy, as is the idea of taking public education money for schools that don't have to respect the basic civil rights of their students with disabilities. I want to thank Josette and of course Jen and Jolene, my colleagues. Next is November 22nd will be our last Raise Your Voice of the year. We're going to wrap up on a few things and talk about what's coming up in 2023 in the Texas legislative session. The election will be over by then, so maybe we'll have some interesting, expected or unexpected things to talk about at that time. As always, Raise Your Voice is free to all its participants, but of course it really isn't free. And to make that happen are our sponsors, and briefly, those are GRAIL, AbbVie, Touch of Class, We Work for Health, Texas, Amgen, AstraZeneca, and our major sponsors of Raise Your Voice, United Healthcare, Superior Health Plan, BristolMyersSquibb, and Amerigroup. Thank you all for joining us today. This was a real thought-provoking one. It's going to stay with me for quite a while after this. Again, thank you all for showing up. Take care.